Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Testing Mobile Devices, Unique Functionality by Michael Udiden. We are excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one in a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming SQTM conference in San Diego, California, September 13th through the 18th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. The conference focuses on advancing the test management and quality management professions by providing practical methods based on best practices. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To view the conference program and more information, visit www.qualitymanagementconference.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Improving the Test Process with Measurements by Alfred Sorkowitz on March 27th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to www.qualitymanagementconference.com. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Michael Udiden.
Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Michael Udiden and it's my pleasure to be your presenter today. A short warning before the presentation commences. It's intended to be viewed only by the individuals who have registered. So please make sure that we are not in violation of the relevant laws. So today's topic is the testing mobile devices unique functionality. It is a topic from a larger class, strategies for testing mobile devices, which we at IST teach at a number of venues. Specifically, it will be delivered at our conference in San Diego on September 17th, 2015. Please go and see the program of the conference. There are quite a few very interesting classes there. Now, mobile testing poses a number of challenges. Some of them are well known. For example, the technology is different and you need to approach it differently. You need to build your lab in a different way. A number of challenges are also posed by the unique functionalities which mobile devices have and other platforms either don't have at all, or have it but it's rarely used, or have it and it's accessed, approached, and used in a totally different way. Now, mobile platforms today are very computationally capable, and they're capable of doing perhaps a regular smartphone that you keep in your pocket packages more computational power than the humanity needed to go to the moon. It also has functionalities which are unique and which make its use so convenient and make this device so useful. During this webinar, we'll touch upon a number of those functionalities, and I will try to suggest a number of methods how we can test them. Those unique functionalities are gestures, which you don't have on most of the PCs and Macs. Location awareness, which you do have on the PCs and Macs, but certainly not in the same way you have on mobile devices, and it's rarely used. Orientation, turning it from the portrait mode to the landscape mode and back. This might happen, of course, intentionally, but also it can happen unintentionally when the device is not switched off and configured not to switch off itself and is laying in your pocket. We'll see what unique challenge it poses for mobile devices, specifically for Androids. The challenge of internationalization, switching it from one language to another or from one country setting to another. It poses a few challenges, and it's quite frequent since mobile apps are deployed today all over the world. And moreover, people traveling from one country to another might want to have, for example, kilometers as a measure of distance, but still, other US settings, or, for example, kilometers as a measure of distance traveling from Europe to the United States, and the possibility to turn to miles. Barcode and check scanning. Now, this functionality becomes more and more frequent. It's exceptionally useful, specifically for enterprise applications. The big question is how we test it. Now, usability is, strictly speaking, not part of functional testing. However, mobile device app or mobile website which is not usable, not easy to learn, or in fact transparent in terms of learning how to use it, and not easy to use is pretty much the one which is destined to the dustbin of digital history. So usability is certainly something which needs special attention when talking about mobile devices. All those subjects we discuss in depth during the larger class. Today, though, I do want to give you a taste of how we can approach the testing of gestures, internationalization, and so on. First, the gestures. There are a whole lot of gestures, and mobile devices, the good ones at least, allow infinite creativity here. But before we approach a particular test, I want to ask two questions. Since test engineers, among other things that we do, we are also advocates of the client. We wear the hat of the client and trying to represent the production inside the test environment, both in terms of hardware and software we use, and also in terms of our approach, for obvious reasons, right? I want to make sure that I do know, first, where the application is used, in which conditions, how it is used, and who will use it. It is particularly important for gestures. For example, if your target audience are travelers, tourists, or business travelers, chances are your application will be used in the airport after your users have carried heavy loads in their hands, carried bags. So you cannot really hope that they would be able to do any advanced gestures because their hands will be shaky. You cannot hope they can do multi-finger tap and do it correctly. You cannot hope they can do multi-finger squeeze. The most you can hope for is a tap, a press, and perhaps a spread, right? Or the pinch. No more than that. Moreover, I want to understand who will be using my applications. Are those, for example, kids who are very agile and have small fingers, so I can go wild with gestures, or perhaps seniors? Today you have quite a few applications which are intended to be used by senior citizens, and therefore, for obvious reasons, you cannot really hope for too sophisticated of a gesture. Will it be used in an environment of a warehouse where people are going to be holding a ladder with one hand and the device with another hand? If this is the case, then you cannot really think about any multi-finger gestures. In general, if we think of that, in many different environments, multi-finger gestures are not such a good idea. Wearing a hat of your customer, perhaps visiting a client site, if it's intended for a unique kind of business, would be a very good idea before you plan your tests. Moreover, talking about gestures, I want to make sure that they work with different screen size, different resolutions. Consider Android devices with almost infinite number of screen resolutions and device sizes. But even in iOS, you have iPhone 5 and iPhone 4, and of course today iPhone 6, which comes in two modifications with different sizes. All this I want to take into consideration when I'm planning my gestures. Another question that I want to ask is, are there any standards? Unfortunately, you don't have an analog of something like Windows User Experience, which is issued by Microsoft and guides the developer and the designer through every single step of what is the Microsoft standard for the look and feel of different elements, what needs to be done when you close the window, how it should look, and so on. You don't have anything like that for gestures. You have a couple of suggestions here and there floating on the web, but it's still a widely open field. The one limitation that you might have is the CFR 508. The United States Code of Federal Regulations, Section 508, talks about accessibility of software applications and software systems in general for people with disabilities. And you have there considerations like, for example, the website, which should be accommodating for special programs that read the website aloud for blind people. For example, if you use any image, you have to use a description. They take into consideration people who are colorblind. Think about using color coding. Red and green are of the same intensity, but look exactly the same for a person who is colorblind. And of course, in terms of gestures, they take into consideration, for example, people who have one hand, limited manual dexterity, and so on and so forth. If your enterprise is supposed to comply with CFR 508, in other words, if it is either serving federal employees or it is serving companies that are CFR 508 compliant, then you need to incorporate it into your testing. See how it impacts the gestures and other areas. If you don't do it at the very beginning, retrofitting an application or a website for 508 is a nightmare do believe my experience. And sometimes companies just back off out of that. So during your test planning stage, it's better to figure out all those questions and then, of course, try and implement them during your testing, write test cases, make sure your multi-finger gestures work in different hardware environments and also with different operating systems might impact them, and so on. Now, of course, all this must be addressed in requirements. And you will see this little comment on a few slides here and on many more slides in the larger class. As a test engineer, I believe it is my duty not only to write test cases based on existing requirements, but also to look at requirements critically. And if I have requirements for a mobile application, native app or a website or a hybrid app, and I don't have anything there about gestures, that's a problem. And that's a problem I want to catch right there at the requirement stage and weed out issues like, for example, application for seniors, and we have press and tap and then drag. Wouldn't fly. Application for traveling businessman, same applies. Application for kids, on the other hand, in many cases you can really go wild. But it all must be addressed in requirements. I want to make sure it is there. I want to inspect the requirements, as you know, we at IST talk in a variety of classes, including mine. Location awareness. Location awareness is another wonderful feature of modern smartphones, modern mobile devices, not only smartphones. And the idea is that either using a GPS receiver or triangulating it by the tower, by the cellular tower, we'll talk about that, the server can know where I am located, the device itself can know where I am located, and serve to me proper functionality, whether guide me from one place to another or offer me the Starbucks establishments which are 5 miles around where I am located now. Now, the big problem with testing it, of course, is the problem that I would call bringing Singapore to Boston, Massachusetts, or any other city where our development would be located, or London to Bangalore, India. Now, it would be really nice if somebody would send us around the world to make sure that the location awareness works properly, but that probably wouldn't happen. And as a test engineer, I do want to test it with different locations. I do want to make sure that when my app is installed on the device on the other part of the world, that proper functionality is served there and not only here. We all know that we cannot rely on the assumption that it will pull everything correctly from the database. In many cases, the database would be different. We'll just connect to some kind of local provider. In many cases, some functionalities are available in some places, not available in others. Think about financial applications or money transfer, right? So because of all that, I do want to bring Singapore to Boston, Massachusetts. The big challenge is how do I do it? We'll certainly talk about it in the next slide. But first, I want to consider the technology here. In general, in testing mobile devices, test engineers at times need to be more aware of the technology used and sometimes even more technologically savvy than the developers. And that's because the platforms here are different quite radically. Toshiba PC versus HP PC or Dell PC is not much of a difference which is relevant for the vast majority of what we test. Android versus iOS is very relevant for a number of reasons. Not only the device itself is architected differently, but also there are things like memory management, which are different in Android and iOS. I talk about that in a larger class quite in depth. Also, the Android manufacturers like to tweak the operating system just a bit, and this just a bit can be very relevant to our tests. Another example is location awareness. How is the device location aware? Is it GPS, the most common, most widespread system in the world, which is maintained by the United States of America? Is it the new Russian GLONASS, which is rather a high quality in the northern part of the world, but not in the southern latitudes? Is it the Chinese Baidu that works in China and very common there? Is it the European Galileo, which is up and coming and already working quite well? Is it all of them? And some devices are capable of connecting to the satellites or receiving the satellite signal from, let's say, GPS and Galileo, and then making the positioning more exact? Do we still use tower triangulation, an old method where the device measures the strength of the signal coming from 3 different cellular towers in the environment, sends it to the database, and the database returns the exact location? Is it combined with GPS? All those I need to understand. And then I can plan my tests better. How, we will see again in the next slide. I also want to consider special cases. Specifically, I want to consider in my tests the signal strength or no signal. What if the GPS signal is weak at different degrees? What if there is no signal at all? I want to make sure my application handles it gracefully. I want to make sure it knows to extrapolate my location when I'm moving, let's say, in the car for a number of seconds before there is a hope to regain the signal. I want to incorporate all of that in my tests. I want to make sure that I incorporate DB updates. When I'm looking for Starbucks, I want to make sure that all what I have updated in the database by this moment shows up on my map, right? So I would have a test case where I am inside the app. It shows, let's say, 3 Starbucks locations. I'm into Starbucks today. And then I add another one and delete existing one, refresh the screen, and I want to see what happens. I want to make sure I know the relevant requirements. Should it happen immediately, within 15 minutes, and plan my tests accordingly to avoid very unpleasant cases in production later, of course. So how do we test it? What's the technique? Well, thankfully, we can bring Singapore to Boston, Massachusetts. We have GPS simulators. These are hardware devices which cost a few $1,000s, but they are certainly worth it. They emit signals that mimic live GPS signals, so you get basically the same signal which overrides the ones from the tower. Now, don't worry, people on the highway close to your office wouldn't feel anything because it works only in a very limited range. They also allow you full control over the signal, no signal at all, stronger signal, 3 satellites, 4 satellites, 5 satellites. All this you can configure here, and of course you can simulate where you are in the world. And this way you literally bring Singapore's location to your desk, and you make sure that it gets all the right information and so on. The good ones, the good GPS simulators, also can simulate GPS alternatives, GLONASS, BeiDou, Galileo. And if your enterprise is already investing in one, it is worth considering the one that can simulate multiple positioning systems. Because today you might be GPS only, but who knows? Maybe then you want to deploy in Europe, and Galileo comes into mind, or in China with BeiDou. Right? So this is how we can approach location awareness testing. And this simulator allows you to literally to mimic the conditions of your target audience, to mimic the location in production. And then go wild with your test cases, do equivalence partitioning, and use all the good old techniques to test different conditions, pretty much without limitation. Now, another issue that we need to address while thinking about unique functionality of mobile devices is, of course, the orientation, turning it backwards and up again, changing the orientation to landscape and portrait and landscape and portrait. Why it is important? This operation is computationally and memory intensive. You need to redraw the whole screen. Whether you have graphics or not, you still redraws the whole screen. And also inside your application frequently reorients the controls. Any computationally and memory intensive operation, of course, can cause memory leaks. We know that. Memory leak when a certain piece of your program or a function library which you inherited from somebody else, which was already compiled, you know where source code, can have a memory leak. It can capture a piece of the computer, or in our case, device's memory, and never release it. Those who programmed in C and C++ know exactly how it happens. You have a pointer, and then you never release the address, and so on. You can have a Java garbage collector set up incorrectly. There are many ways to have memory leaks. Now, different devices here are affected differently. The way memory space is managed in iOS devices is what they address frequently as sandboxing, the programmatic version of it. Each application gets a certain piece of memory, and that's where it can play its own sandbox. When it needs more, it crashes, but the device stays alive. Now that's good for the user, but it's bad enough for me if my application crashed. Right? On Android devices, we have a whole variety of CPUs, memory size, the algorithms the operating system uses to redraw the screen. Of course, the different manufacturers of Android devices change the operating system just a bit, and this just a bit can affect what we are testing here. Now, naturally, the differences in the application under test also can affect the load on the CPU and memory size. The question is, how do I do that? I probably wouldn't put any test engineer to be sitting here turning the device back and forth and back and forth. I will get, a thick medical bill from the court very soon because of the wrist problems. There are ways, of course, to do it. And one of those ways, perhaps the ultimate one, is a little device which can be built by any intern you hire with a penchant to electronics. The device would have a servo motor which would turn back and forth the phone that you're holding in the cell phone holder, like similar to the one that you have in the car. Now, with the USB cord, you connect it to a PC, and it controls how many times it turns it and such. So you can set this device to turn it 400 times back and forth, and then you can run a series of manual tests or automated tests. It is certainly possible to automate tests for mobile devices. We discuss it pretty much in depth in the class. And then you run a series of tests to make sure the application is still alive and responding properly. Okay. Once you build this device, you can use it for multiple mobile devices in multiple tests, in multiple iterations of your test, and so on. And that's perhaps the ultimate way to test the orientation, the reliability test, also called endurance test or long-haul test. Where you do something for a long time and make sure that memory leaks don't kill your application. A very important test, specifically when you're talking about critical applications or applications where people are not about to switch the device in the middle. Real estate, medical, many others. Internationalization, one of my favorites. Internationalization in our context means switching the interface from either one country to another, or from one language to another, or both. Unfortunately, there is an unwelcome diversity in the ways that mobile devices do that. In some devices, in some applications, you switch it at the application level. No matter what the device is, whether it's configured for France or for Japan, the application itself defines its language, its interfaces, its metrics and measurement system, and so on. In other cases, you have to switch it at the device level. You change the device from, say, English to German, or from US to Germany, which might be very different, and then all your interfaces change. The worst case scenario is when this problem hasn't been addressed, and there is a hodgepodge. Some menus are in English, and some are in German, and somewhere you see kilometers, somewhere you see miles. And this happens usually when nobody ever tested it for internationalization. Here's an example. This is an application which is supposed to calculate a variety of expenses, including mileage. Traveling businessmen calculate mileage. The income tax authority, the US IRS, and others then give it back to them. So here, the device was switched to German. German as a language, not Germany as a country. When I do that, I certainly don't expect my interface to switch to kilometers. I might be a German businessman traveling in the US. Look what it did. Some menus, like Einträge on the left, good. Another like Neu, new, is good as well. Yet other menus don't fit anymore. Other captions don't fit anymore into their controls. That's a very well-known problem with the German language. The words are long. I want to test for it. But there is a worse problem here. On the left screen, We have 42 miles for the first record. However, when I click on details, I see kilometer at the top and kilometers, 42 kilometers. Now, 42 kilometers and 42 miles are two very different distances. And the question asked is, of course, how do I calculate the cost, right? This can have legal implications as well as somebody who's after them. Quite a problem. This is why we need to test for internationalization. There are special cases here that we need to address. First, language versus country. You can have German and United States, so the language should be German, but then you should still have miles and pounds and gallons. When you switch, on the other hand, between US and Canada, for example, then you still have English, unless it's Quebec, but then you should have kilometers instead of miles, and the imperial gallon instead of standard US gallon. It's slightly larger. So all that I want to incorporate into my testing. I want to understand exactly how it works requirements-wise, incorporate into my testing, and test it. There is also a special case of traveling devices. A person travels from one country to another, say from US to Spain. Right? Now, obviously, I want to keep English as a language. Right? I wouldn't learn Spanish right there on the airplane. Right? That would be mission impossible. However, I do want to, however, the question asked is, should our application now switch to kilometers in terms of distance or not, to the local system, the standard European system of metrics and measures? That's a question that I want to ask as a test engineer and later incorporate into my test case. It's a very important question. I want to test for it. This can have legal implications if your application calculates anything like expenses or distances or anything else. Imagine somebody, looking for an emergency room, and that's 100 miles instead, 100 kilometers instead of 100 miles. Quite a difference. In fact, of 61 kilometers or so. Right? So internationalization is something I certainly want to test for. Another few considerations here, of course, are about how do we test it for languages we do not know. Chinese, Japanese, Hebrew, Arabic. There are ways to do it, of course, related to automation. And that's something we certainly touch upon in the larger class. Barcode and check scanning. Now, one of the bigger benefits that mobile devices can bring us is getting rid of special equipment for a variety of purposes. Each modern smartphone has a really good camera. You compare them to cameras of 15 years ago, night and day. Right? Now, here, we can snap pictures and upload them immediately. Think about real estate. Think about snapping a picture of some kind of fixture at an exhibition and then sending it to your headquarters. That's quite well known. But we also can scan barcodes. You can scan barcodes when you are, let's say, working at Lowe's or Home Depot or now Target or another store. You can equip your employees with mobile devices that scan barcodes and take inventory. The next coming, by the way, is a little add-on for RFID scanning, right? You can also scan barcodes for other purposes. Today you have QR codes, this square little thing, which packs more information than a regular barcode. And that's where you can scan it and do price comparison. You scan the QR code, it finds the product, goes online, does the price comparison, and lets you know whether the price you're just about to pay is reasonable or not. You also, of course, want to scan checks. More and more banks, all the good banks at least, are now allowing you to scan checks and this way deposit them. It's great for the user. It's excellent for the bank for obvious reasons. You don't need that much personnel, that many people there. You don't need that many branches and so on. Now, how do I test for that? Well, I want to plan my test here in a way where I mimic production. First, I want to make sure that I know which types of barcodes we are going to scan. There are different barcode fonts. There are different types of QR codes. I want to prepare a little library. My test data here would be pages with those barcodes which I want to scan. When I'm talking about checks, I also want to think about different fonts and whether it allows to scan handwritten checks. I once tested an application which had handwriting scanning and then OCR, optical character recognition, and it was quite interesting. We prepared, different forms filled by people with different handwriting style, in different ink, different thickness of the pen, and such and such and such and such. So this was our equivalence partitioning different types of cases. Right? Now, I also want to think about the paper. Are we going to scan barcodes from round surfaces or curved surfaces, like here with the ice cream, or only from flat surfaces? I want to know it. What is going to be the distance between the device and the barcode we are going to scan? I want to mimic those distances in my test environment. What's going to be the paper? Is the paper going to be white or colored as well? In checks, for example, I want to prepare a whole library of check samples and scan them one after another to make sure that it works with different types of paper, different coloring, different background, and so on. What's the lighting going to be? I want to research the expected lighting conditions. Think about warehouse on one hand, where we barely have any light usually. Or as opposed to that, think about a department store or a restaurant or a harsh light of the hospital corridors. There can be more than one. So after I researched all that and I have a little library of barcodes to scan and checks to scan, now the question is, how do I do that? Would I be sitting there doing it manually for hours and hours every time we have a new release? Sometimes it's mission impossible, sometimes it's mission annoying. Or I can automate it. There is certainly a way to automate this kind of testing. And if we think about automation, most of the people will tell you, well, we need to automate the functionality which never changes first. There are some merits to it. But I think that the first thing we should automate is that kind of test which takes 80% of our time and 10% or even less of our mind power. And this is exactly the one. Scanning 150 different types of checks in a row. That's what I want to automate. It's possible. It requires some creativity, but it's certainly possible. We talk about it in the class. So I want to keep some suspense here. In any case, if you need to test barcode and check scanning, this is something you need to plan very carefully for and take into consideration the different factors here. Now we are getting to usability. Perhaps my favorite for this webinar. Now, usability is about the ease of learning and using the system, and I want to separate those two. It's very relevant to mobile. Everybody will tell you that usability is the ease of use, and that's great. But when we have a very competitive market, and when you have a whole lot of providers, your application needs to be transparent in terms of learning. Someone needs to open it and start using right away. Usually you don't have the luxury of training. You also don't have a captive user like in a bank who doesn't have a choice. A bank teller doesn't, but to sit there and use whatever system we offer them. So here, I want to make sure that it's really easy to learn how to use the application. And in most of the cases, you don't need to learn it at all. It's obvious. It's intuitive. How do I approach this kind of testing? Well, we can separate the usability test into two categories, if you wish, two age categories or two levels. I would call them minor in usability and major in usability. The major in usability are really advanced tests that usually require usability experts. We will talk about that. Minor in usability, though, are the necessary basics, and these are accessible to any one of us, each and every one of us, to any test engineer. It's just a matter of paying attention and learning how to do it. Now, major usability is a must for quite a few applications. If you're expecting an audience of 20 million people, and 1% of you, on losing 1 or 2% of users is a financial risk for you, or a loss, then it's really worth investing into major in usability. The rumor goes that Microsoft has usability labs where as many people work as in the regular testing labs. I don't know if it's true, but Microsoft spends a whole lot on usability, right? And I believe that the results do show, right? If the application is going to be mission critical, military, medical, then certainly major usability makes sense. There, an operator error can cause a loss in property and sometimes in human life. For all applications, with no exception, I believe that minor usability is a must. Let's do a little exercise. Consider, for example, a color palette and fonts for the following applications: price comparison, retail store associate application, the applications they I know use on the mobile devices, ruggedized devices in the Targets and the Lowe's and the Home Depots of the world. Appointment scheduling for doctor's office, travel booking, and patient registration for emergency medicine. Now, those 5 types of applications pose totally different requirements for color palette and fonts. And as a test engineer, I can think of that. I don't need usability expert for it. For example, with price comparison, usually a person is not in a rush and is not going to fall down from the ladder if it's too bright, right? But here, my main thing is to compare prices. So I want to make sure that my fonts are really clear, right? And are really telling. And that's what I would focus on. And if I, as a test engineer, have trouble differentiating between different fonts here because of the color, that's quite a problem. On the other hand, let's look at the Retail Store Associate app. This is kind of app which will be frequently used with one hand. That's what I want to mimic in my minor in usability. I want to make sure I don't have advanced gestures, for example, which require multi-finger touch. Stylus would be also a very bad idea here, right? Because it needs 2 hands to use. One is holding the device, another one using the stylus, right? Here, I want to avoid all kinds of color combinations that can be inconvenient and problematic in the dim light of the warehouse. For example, using a subtle shade of gray and a subtle shade of orange together is a very bad idea. I want to use off-white and black, right? If I consider appointment scheduling for doctor's office, I need to consider that that's where a variety of problems can come in. For example, here I don't want a really rich color palette. That's useless. But I do want to make sure that people whose hands are shaky can still use the application. With travel booking, I certainly can use more graphics. Travel booking is usually done when you can count on the person using 2 hands. Usually at the person's leisure, I can go more wild. On the other hand, the registration for emergency medicine, each additional screen and each additional click at the risk that somebody will die while we are playing with the application. I want to consider it in my usability tests. With that said, let's look at how we can do that. Now, quite a while ago, an international guru in usability, Jacob Nielsen, you have here a link to his website, came up with 10 classical usability heuristics. Now, those at the first glance seem fairly general. However, when you apply them to each particular case, you will see that they are very concrete and specific, and we will see a couple of examples today. The first one is the visibility of the system status. The system should always keep users informed about what is going on through appropriate feedback within a reasonable time. I should know if my application is stuck or not. I should know that my check is now being uploaded and when it has finished uploading. A simple thing, but I want to make sure I police for that. Match between system and the real world. That's usually a plague of specialized applications. If you use abbreviations, you want to make sure the user knows what they are. Otherwise, they wouldn't understand. And you usually cannot count on an external user to know your internal abbreviations, even though they seem totally obvious to you. Right? Anybody who's done mortgage would know that we sometimes pull our hair out to understand what kind of abbreviations they use and to look for it and so on. User control and freedom. You want to make sure that the user has an emergency exit, can undo, redo, roll back, and so on. Of course, I want consistency and standards. Very frequently, the adoption rate depends precisely on that. I want to make sure that within the realm of applications of the similar type, we are consistent not only in terms of using terms and colors and stuff, but also in terms of functionality. Right? If all the applications in our area, in our realm, of our type, have menus on the bottom, I better put them there. Another interesting principle here, and I cannot really talk about all of them in depth, but I would mention a few, is recognition rather than recall. It also helps with error prevention. It is a well-known fact in psychology that if you are asked to memorize a list of words and then you need to write them down from memory, your performance wouldn't be as good. You wouldn't remember as many words as if they were displayed on the screen or presented on the page, and you should check off those which were in the first list. To recognize something, to choose between options, it's much easier than to recall them. We should minimize the user's memory load by making objects, actions, options available. We'll see a few examples. Right? Selecting options is a much better idea specifically for mobile than textual entry, because textual entry here is naturally slow and in some cases limited, again using one hand for example. Right? We cannot really type on this keyboard. We need to use two of our thumbs, to enter data in most of the mobile devices. Tablets are probably an exception, but not all of them. Flexibility and efficiency of use. If your application can be used by expert users, you should allow them to configure shortcuts, sometimes useful. Aesthetic and minimalist design. That sounds very, very general, but it is actually not. And any test engineer can test for it. We'll see a few examples. Now, let's look at a few examples. Visibility of the system status. On the leftmost screen, you look at the screen, you immediately see that there is an update waiting for an application. Boom, right away. On the next screen, you see a little scrolling wheel, spinning wheel, and now you know that something is being loaded. Make sure that the wheel indeed spins. Right? These are common examples. Now here is a more subtle one. You usually don't have a blinking cursor in your mobile app. So here the Facebook accorded us the possibility to know into which field my data entry will go when I tap something on the keyboard, where it will go, by highlighting it with a slightly thicker green line. Now this might be a good idea, however, it's not CFR 508 compliant because colorblind people wouldn't see it clearly. So having a blinking cursor would be a good idea as well. A really good idea, in fact. And then making sure this cursor blinks in a variety of devices. Right? Or having something written in gray, enter data here. Think about that. You don't need to be a usability expert to spot this kind of issue. Error prevention. Now this ad nauseum usability experts would tell mobile developers and designers that the field needs to be large enough for people with thicker thumbs or shaky hands to click there, and still doesn't work. Look at this application. The Find button is quite small, but there is enough space to make it much larger, so people can easily click it. Now here we are looking up for information, sort of Yellow Pages app. So here it's even more important because people will use it in suboptimal conditions when sitting in the car in the parking lot, for example. Of course, none of us does it at the traffic light. Holding the device in one hand and so on. The field what could have been much wider either. We have enough space here. And that could have made errors not really committed. That would have helped error prevention because right now it's quite easy to hit beauty salons instead of the Find button. Right? Now, recognition rather than recall. That's where this application is quite excellent. Besides entering data, we can also select here the most commonly looked for destinations. For example, gas stations right in the middle. What would you need mobile device for in terms of looking up for X or Y? So look for gas station, for a bank, for bar or pub, for coffee, for pizza, for restaurants. Now, please your attention here. If we were really logical, we would put pizza and coffee under the restaurants. But I don't want to be overly logical here. I want to be usable here. And we know that the two types of restaurants that people frequently look for on mobile devices are pizza and coffee. Right? And then we have hardware, which is slightly problematic for me as a computer person, means different things for me. And then we have bars and pubs, beauty salons, and taxis, or cabs if it were deployed in England. Now, it would be really nice if based on my frequency of clicks, the application would adjust itself on my device to put in the middle those things that I look for the most. If I'm a person who looks for dog grooming all the time, but never looks for, let's say, taxis, it should put dog grooming here. This is also something for which you don't need to be a usability expert. But moreover, this application is even smarter. When I type dog, it presents few options here underneath my data entry fields. And that's a great idea because typing grooming is quite a pain on any mobile device. That's what I want to find here as a test engineer paying attention to usability. Now, the major in usability is a different animal. Or I should say it's a more evolved version of the same animal. Here we ask a different set of questions, and this is usually handled by the experts. For example, can the app be operated effectively with one hand? As a test engineer, I certainly can ask, can it be operated at all? Usability expert will measure the effectiveness of the operation here. Is it as easy as, for example, with two hands? Can the app be operated by different demographics? This is a fascinating area. And here the usability is not limited to shaky hands, not shaky hands, larger thumb, smaller thumb, more manual dexterity, less manual dexterity. Here we are also talking about icons being easily recognizable by different people. Some of you probably remember the ancient times when the Eudora email application was the absolute leader of email apps. Their standard icon on a PC was an image of a standard North American mailbox with a little red flag and such. Almost everybody else outside North America was really puzzled what that would mean because the mailboxes there look totally different. In fact, people are very creative in different countries in terms of the look and feel of the mailboxes. The Japanese mailbox looks different, the European looks different, the Chinese looks different, and so on. Only in North America, that's how mailboxes really look like. And maybe perhaps in other places where they mimic this type of mailbox, but majority of places of the world, different mailbox. Same applies here. Our icons should be easily comprehensible by our target audiences. What is, for example, a red cross for North America is a red crescent in most of the Muslim countries, and the red Magen David in Israel, and the little red lion in Thailand and a couple of other places. If my application is really smart, it will adjust to it. But you usually need to be a usability expert to pay attention to those things. Does response time answer implicit user expectations? A very important question. Response time can kill a mobile app. Now, first I want to have it in the requirements, of course, but then I also want somebody to examine it carefully and think. A login, for example, that's where most of the users usually are ready to spend a few seconds, but not in the most frequent operation the application does. If you are about to look up the weather and you tap on the application icon and it takes 5 seconds to open it, it seems like 20 seconds. Our internal clock works differently when we are anticipating something versus when we are just going home at our leisure from work or whatever. Right. So for this, usability experts have whole rules and techniques and methods. Do menus and workflows make sense? Can data entry be accomplished with minimal effort and minimal errors? They use a variety of techniques like tracking eye movements, which is very easy with the camera, tracking finger movements, a field versus lab study, and so on. Highly recommended when your application is either critical or is going to be deployed to a very large population, and any loss of usage base is important. Now, this presentation, this webinar, presented to you a number of topics from our larger class, the strategies for testing mobile devices. Now, in this larger class, there will be, of course, a few more topics. We will start the class with mobile testing challenges because we want to understand what we are up against, but we'll not stop there. Based on those challenges, we'll outline the mobile testing strategy. And the idea here is to take all the knowledge from the good old testing, all the theory, and apply it to the practice of mobile testing. What is different in testing the functionality for mobile devices? We touched upon a number of things here, the unique functionalities. We'll go there more in depth. What's unique in terms of testing the performance for mobile devices? Fascinating area as well. We touched upon it slightly with reliability tests. There is, of course, more to it. What about the compatibility tests? How do we plan our test lab? Do we rent a test lab? Do we buy the devices? Do we use the hybrid approach? What are the factors that should influence our decision here? All that we'll talk about compatibility testing, and of course, how do we plan on which devices to retest what functionalities. I don't want to run 100% of my tests on all platforms. I want to run the relevant subset of tests on different platforms. We'll talk about how do we decide. Usability, of course, more in depth than we discussed here. Security tests for mobile devices. What do we do about that? How it is possible? What are the dangers? The paradigmatic case of a lost device is certainly something we want to pay attention to. How do we test applications for interoperability? Being able to connect to different other platforms, not to run on them, but to connect, say, to different databases under different conditions of use. How do we do user acceptance tests for mobile devices, and so on. We will talk relatively in depth about Mobile Test Lab with some examples as well. And of course, we'll talk about automating mobile tests. Not only it's possible, it also seems to be more necessary than for many non-mobile apps, PC and Mac apps, and mainframe. Why it is so? Well, all the good old reasons for why automate tests plus the data entry is much more painful, takes much longer time on mobile devices than on a regular computer. The factor is between 2 and 5. It's either twice longer or even more, depending on the frequency of data entry, how much you have of the recognition rather than recall, choosing an option rather than typing text, and so on. But in any case, automation here is pretty much a must. And there are some tests that it's not feasible to do manually at all. For example, massive barcode scanning and check scanning. For example, the reliability test, turning it landscape portrait. For example, tests inside Faraday cage, which blocks reception or reduces the level of reception. It's quite important for many kinds of tests. So here, getting yourself into Faraday cage, you need to build a really huge one, which costs $100,000. On the other hand, you can have a Faraday cage which stands on your desk and costs $2,000, or a real Cadillac Faraday cage is maybe $2,500. You cannot get into it, right? It's too small. So you need to automate the test. We'll also talk during this class about how to put together a mobile testing team and what are the considerations, the skills we need to look for, whether it's possible to find all the necessary skills on the market, how do we decide about the balance between training versus acquiring skills from the outside and such. The next available date is September 17, 2015 for this class in the beautiful city of San Diego, California. You have a link here to see the whole program. We have many other interesting classes as well at the same during the same week at the same location. That's our annual conference. It was my pleasure to deliver this webinar to you. Okay? And now I certainly want to turn the stage to Eric. Eric?
Thank you, Michael, for your time today. And so it does look like we have one question if you had a couple seconds to look at that.
Oh, most certainly. Of course. Okay, let me see the question. Vijay from Ford. Hello, Vijay. We have a couple of questions. All the various dimensions you have reflected, would you be able to appropriately map the tool simulators existing to meet those dimensions? This will be very helpful to consider, especially for the organizations thinking about setting up mobile testing teams. Let me address this question. This question comes up every time at any class and almost at any presentation. First, I want really to differentiate between real devices and emulators. An emulator is a computer program which mimics the behavior of the device inside a Mac or a PC. Now, the allure is really, it's a very alluring option. Instead of purchasing all those devices or renting them, you have this program and that can, by choosing a different option in the menu, mimic an iPhone 5 and iPhone 6 and iPad 2 and iPad mini and whatnot. Right? So this is a very alluring option. Indeed, for unit tests, I would strongly recommend it. The problem with the emulators is that it's not a real device. It's not real hardware. And as test engineers, we know that when you do not test it in the target platform, you always miss something. And here we can miss a whole lot. The memory, the CPU, everything is different. So I would strongly recommend to run system tests on real devices, right? Now, with compatibility tests, and we certainly would plan which functionality needs to be executed on which device. You don't need to repeat all of them. But real devices are quite a must. Moreover, when you have a hotfix for the operating system, a patch, doesn't matter which mobile operating system it is, first and foremost, they apply it to real devices. And only then they go and adjust their emulator. But here we are losing the whole purpose of the thing. I want to make sure with the hotfix I test it right away on the target platform. And here emulators wouldn't help me at all. Right? Now, when I'm choosing which devices to use, I would use a number of criteria. In the larger class, we discussed it pretty much in depth. I usually recommend, just in a nutshell, I usually recommend keeping the devices that are most frequent and the newest in your lab, even though it's an expense. Because if you want to rent it from an external lab, not always they would have the latest devices. And in the class, I go into the details why. There are some economic, financial reasons for that, and technical engineering reasons as well. Also, the lab costs money. Once you spend $500 and purchase the device that most of the users will use in the next year or so, you can use it at your convenience. You don't have to pay per hour. The labs, external labs, where you rent the devices, usually charge you per hour. There are multiple factors to decide the frequency of use of the device, the types of tests you're executing, the frequency of releases, and so on. And we certainly discuss them in a larger class. So I hope I answered your first question. So now to the second question. Can you please share your thoughts which we should be aware of while setting up mobile lab to access globally? Oh, yes. I will start first from the legal side of things. If your lab is located in the United States in a certain state, it is liable according to the laws of this state. You can go after it if something goes wrong. For example, if somebody steals your code. Or if you are unable to run your test because the lab was down, or your device in the lab were down, and that was critical to you, you can pull out the service level agreement and go after them. If your lab is overseas in India, in Israel, in China, elsewhere, the question of the effectiveness of you going after them legally, if needed, whether somebody stole your application or anything else happened, it is questionable. It depends on how strong is your legal department, the laws in this country, and so on and so forth. So that's consideration number one, and you need to be aware of that. Second, you need to be aware of a few technical issues. Again, for the lack of time, I cannot go really in depth, but just in a nutshell. How frequently they update the devices? Is the technology which the lab uses capable to onboard, let's say, a new iPhone in a matter of a week, or they cannot even give you a timeline? That's a huge issue, because I usually want to make sure that our application runs on the new devices, our hybrid app, or even our mobile website, right? You need to look in the SLA. You want to look into the history of the lab, for how long they've been operating, how quickly they onboard new devices usually, and so on. You want to make sure that the lab has a hot side and the cold side for backup. Imagine a lab located in coastal Texas. No offense to coastal Texas, but hurricanes happen there just like in Florida. I don't want to be down for a week because a hurricane happened 1,000 miles away. I want to make sure that this lab has enough staff and can really support me. If I call and say, hey, my device is down, I need it solved, I want to talk to somebody about that. I once looked at the service level agreement for one overseas lab, and in the depth of it, I found the following. If your device is down, we commit to restoring it within 24 hours. Now imagine your team sitting and waiting for the device being restored in 24 hours. I also want to look really carefully into the costs. Many labs would try to sell you devices or rent you devices with the basic price, fairly low one, for 100 hours a month. And frequently we'll think, well, 100 hours a month, I mean, that should be enough for us. But then you quickly discover that you needed 200 or even 400 hours a month. if you have, let's say, two teams from different locations using it. And then you are hit with the bill for extra hours, which is usually much higher than the basic one. I know at least about one very sizable media company which stopped using an external lab because of cost considerations. There are a few more factors, but those are perhaps the central one, the central dimensions in terms of choosing the lab. And then I have the third question. Today we are programming mobile testing using cloud. Please share your thoughts on these lines and what are your thoughts on Perfecta. Well, first, I would refrain from talking about any particular provider for a variety of reasons. In terms of cloud, all what I said to the lab applies to the cloud. When I am automating mobile tests, I want to make sure that the technology is such that we use a real device without strings attached. Nobody carries a device in a pocket which is hardwired and hooked up to a special server which allows inputs and outputs. If this is our way to automate the testing of the device, we are up to many surprises in production. Because the way the user handles the device by, sending the inputs through the screen is not like sending the input through the wire that goes straight into the device itself. It's different. Nobody carries in his pocket a desktop harness into which you plug the device and which controls it later, which is an unfortunately common method for some companies, wouldn't name the names, to automate tests for mobile devices. My advice would be, if you go for automation, try to keep it to the real device as much as possible. Remote control of the device, which is unaltered in terms of hardware, would be probably the best method. The maximum you can go for is, let's say, jailbreaking iOS device, but I certainly wouldn't suggest to use something which requires hardware modification of the device itself. And there are a few different methods of automating your mobile testing, and we discussed those methods relatively in depth in the class with some examples as well. So, Vijay, I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you, Michael, for your time today, and thanks to everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great day.